2.5 miles across. That is the width of the largest of the foreign objects buried in the middle of Mars. Chunks of rock, hundreds of them scattered through the deep interior of the planet, that seismic waves crash into and scatter off of like a beam of light hitting shattered glass. They are not part of the Mars that formed here. They are the wreckage of something else, driven down into the planet and sealed there, and they have been sitting motionless in the dark for 4.5 billion years, or longer than there has been solid ground on Earth for anyone to stand on. And we only confirmed they were there in the late summer of 2025. Now, the title. 7 minutes ago, nothing happened at Mars. I'm not going to insult you by pretending a discovery landed in your lap in the last few hundred seconds. The word just in a story like this is doing an enormous amount of quiet lifting. The truth is stranger, and I'd argue, far better. This discovery came out of data recorded by a machine that has been dead and buried in dust since December of 2022, silent on a Martian plane. Its work not finished, but merely paused, because the numbers it sent home are so rich that scientists are still pulling brand new worlds out of them years later. And the thing it found had been waiting, untouched, since before the first cell ever divided in Earth's oceans. If you've been here before, you know we've already gone spelunking into the guts of Mars once, down through the crust, past a hidden shell of molten rock, to a possible ocean's worth of water locked in the deep. This is the second descent. And this time, we're not hunting for the layers that belong. We're hunting for the things down there that don't. The buried anomalies, the structures that have no business being where they are, ending with those fragments in the mantle. Because here's the promise for the next 20 minutes. By the end, you'll understand what those buried chunks actually are, where they came from, and why Mars is very possibly the only place in the entire solar system where you could still find them at all. Everything Earth ever swallowed like this is gone. Mars kept the receipts. Keep those fragments in mind. We climb down to them layer by layer, and every layer on the way is stranger than the one above it. Let's begin near the surface, because the first buried structure is one nobody expected to find where it's sitting, and it's made of the most valuable substance on Mars. Stretched across the Martian equator is a vast, soft, pale region called the Medusae Fossae Formation. For decades, it was one of the planet's great shrugs, a huge deposit of what everyone assumed was just wind-blown dust and volcanic ash, sculpted by the wind into long ridges, quietly shedding material that helps coat the whole planet red. Boring, in the way a filing cabinet is boring. Then radar looked underneath it. The European Space Agency's Mars Express orbiter carries an instrument called MARSIS, a subsurface sounder that fires radio waves down into the ground and reads what bounces back from the hidden layers below. And when a team led by Thomas Waters of the Smithsonian Institution re-examined this region with fresh MARSIS data, published in early 2024, the deposit turned out to be far deeper than anyone had realized. In places, up to 3.7 kilometers thick. That's a buried structure taller, top to bottom, than most mountain ranges are tall. But the depth wasn't the shock. The shock was what the radar signature looked like. It didn't look like a giant pile of compacted dust. It looked, layer for layer, like the ice-rich deposits at Mars's polar caps. The ones we know are packed with frozen water. Buried under hundreds of meters of dry dust at the equator, appears to be one of the largest reservoirs of water ice ever found on the planet. Here's the number that makes it land. If you melted all the ice, thought to be locked in that formation, it would drown the entire surface of Mars under a layer of water somewhere between 1.5 and nearly 3 meters deep. Enough, the researchers noted, to fill Earth's Red Sea. And it's sitting near the equator. A place where, under the thin, cold, modern Martian air, exposed ice has no business surviving at all. It shouldn't be there, and it's not alone. Years earlier, radar had already exposed a buried sheet of ice up in the mid-northern plains of Utopia Planitia, holding roughly as much water as Lake Superior, the largest of North America's Great Lakes, hidden under cracked and pitted ground. The pattern was becoming clear. Mars is hiding water, in bulk. In places the textbooks said it couldn't. You just have to see through the dust. If the idea of an entire buried sea disguised as a dust field grabs you, take 1 second and subscribe. Because we're about to leave the shallow buried structures behind, and the next one isn't a deposit. It's a wound the size of a hemisphere. To see it, you have to stop looking at Mars close up and look at the whole globe at once, because there's something deeply strange about the shape of the planet that's so big it's easy to miss. Mars has 2 faces. The southern hemisphere is old, battered, heavily cratered highland terrain, and its crust is thick. The northern hemisphere is something else entirely. Smoother, lower, geologically younger, and its crust is dramatically thinner. The line between them running around the planet is called the hemispheric dichotomy, and it is one of the most prominent features on Mars and one of the oldest. For a long time, nobody could explain why a planet would have 2 such radically different halves. And the leading explanation, laid out in a set of studies back in 2008, is almost too big to picture. The idea is that early in its history, Mars was struck, not by an ordinary asteroid, but by something on the scale of a small planet, hitting at a shallow, glancing angle. Analyses of Mars' gravity and topography traced the outline of the scar this would have left and found it forms a colossal ellipse, roughly 10,600 kilometers by 8,500, a gouge covering something like 40% of the entire surface of the planet. If it's real, this feature, called the Borealis Basin, would be the single largest impact structure known anywhere in the solar system. Sit with the scale of that. The entire smooth northern lowlands of Mars, nearly half the planet, would not be terrain at all. It would be the floor of one unimaginable crater, carved in a single catastrophic instant, and then buried and softened by billions of years of lava and sediment settling into it. Part of the rim is thought to be hidden beneath the giant Tharsis volcanoes that erupted over it later, and beneath the young northern surface, ghostly outlines of ancient craters lie buried, hinting at just how old that hidden floor really is. I have to be straight with you, the way I promised. This one is not settled. The giant impact explanation is the frontrunner, but it competes with another idea, that the two-faced crust was shaped from the inside by slow churning convection in Mars's mantle, heaving material toward one hemisphere. Astronomers cannot yet definitively prove which story is true, because a scar that ancient, buried, that deep, and reworked for that long is fiendishly hard to read. But hold on to both possibilities, because they're about to collide with the third and final buried structure, the one this whole video is named for, and one of them is going to get a spectacular piece of supporting evidence from the deepest place we've looked. Because whether or not one giant impact carved the north, we now have direct evidence that Mars, in its infancy, was hit by enormous objects. And we have it because those impacts left something behind, thousands of kilometers down. Let me pause here for a breath, since we've passed the halfway point and the payoff is close. If any of this is landing for you, genuinely helps it reach other people who'd want to see it. And I'm curious, drop it in the comments. Before today, did you know almost half of Mars might be a single buried crater? Most people have no idea. Okay, now, down to the bottom of the story. To understand what was found, you have to understand how we found it. And it comes back to that dead lander I mentioned at the start. NASA's InSight touched down on Mars in November of 2018 with one purpose: to listen. It set the first seismometer ever placed on the Martian surface against the ground and waited for the planet to shake. Over the next 4 years, it recorded more than 1,300 Marsquakes before dust smothered its solar panels and it fell silent. And those quakes are the only tool we have for this job, because seismic waves are the closest thing we possess to X-ray vision for a planet. As they travel through the interior, they speed up in some materials, slow down in others, and scatter when they slam into something with a different density than its surroundings. Rate how they arrive, and you can map what they pass through, thousands of kilometers below any drill we could ever build. In 2025, an international team led by Konstantinos Charalambous of Imperial College London went back through InSight's archive and focused on 8 particularly powerful seismic events, quakes and impacts whose waves punched deep into the planet. And in those waves, they found a signature nobody was expecting. As the waves passed through the Martian mantle, the thick layer of rock between the crust and the core, they slowed and scattered far more than they should have if the mantle were the smooth, well-blended layer we'd imagined. The pattern pointed to something specific. The mantle is not uniform at all. It is studded throughout, with distinct lumps of rock. Foreign bodies, different from the material around them, scattered through the deep interior in a range of sizes. The largest of them measure up to 4 kilometers across, about 2.5 miles, wide enough to swallow a major city. And the arrangement, Charalambous said, looks like shattered glass, a scatter of large shards surrounded by a rain of smaller fragments. So what are they? Turn the clock back 4.5 billion years to the birth of the solar system, when the young planets were still being assembled out of a storm of rock, and worlds were routinely slammed by other worlds, the same era of colossal collisions that, on Earth, is thought to have blasted out the material that became our moon. When objects that large hit the young Mars, they didn't just leave a crater. They released enough energy to melt continent-sized regions of the planet into oceans of magma, and in the violence, fragments of the impactors themselves, pieces of the asteroids and protoplanets that struck, along with shattered chunks of Mars's own early crust, were driven down and mixed deep into the molten interior. Then Mars cooled. And here is the crucial part. The reason those fragments are still down there to be found, Earth would have erased them. Our planet has plate tectonics and a vigorously churning mantle that recycles its own interior over and over, endlessly stirring and resurfacing, wiping the deep record of its violent birth almost clean. Mars did not do this. Mars, being smaller, cooled into what geologists call a stagnant lid, a solid, unbroken shell over a sluggish, barely stirring interior. There are no drifting plates. The mantle turns over so slowly that over 4.5 billion years it never blended those buried fragments back in. They just sat there, preserved, like shrapnel, frozen in amber. Which means the interior of Mars is something Earth can never be. A genuine physical time capsule of the solar system's most violent hour, with the actual pieces of the impactors still embedded inside it. As Caroline put it, we have never seen the inside of a planet in this kind of detail before. A mantle studded with ancient fragments still there, telling us that Mars has barely changed inside for billions of years. And now watch those two stories snap together. Remember the Borealis Basin, the possible hemisphere-sized crater carved by a planet-scale impact? The mantle fragments are physical evidence that Mars really did endure exactly that kind of monstrous bombardment in its youth. They don't prove the Borealis impact specifically happened, but they prove the era of giant impacts that could have carved it was real and left its mark permanently inside the planet. The buried scar on the surface and the buried shrapnel in the depths are two echoes of the same primordial violence, one written across the face of Mars, one hidden in its heart. So step back and look at what's actually buried under that quiet red desert. Sheets of ancient water ice, kilometers thick, disguised as dust fields where ice should not survive. Possibly the largest impact crater in the solar system, making up nearly half the planet, hidden beneath lava and time. And in the deepest dark, the scattered, shattered remains of the worlds that hammered Mars into existence, kept intact for 4.5 billion years by a planet too sluggish inside to ever forget. 3 structures, at 3 depths, each one a thing that Mars is hiding. And every one of them found not by digging, but by reading the faint signals that pass through or bounce off the planet from the outside. And this is where honesty has to close the story, because none of these can be touched. Every one is an inference, drawn from radar echoes and the trembling of a planet, read by machines that cannot reach out and grab a sample. The equatorial ice is buried under hundreds of meters of dust that no rover can dig through. The Borealis Basin is a debated shape traced in gravity and elevation, still argued over. And the mantle fragments sit thousands of kilometers below the deepest hole any human technology could ever hope to drill. We know they're there the way you know a wall is hollow by knocking on it, not by opening it up. To confirm any of it directly, we would need to drill into another planet on a scale that isn't remotely possible, or send missions we haven't built to places we can barely reach. So these buried structures will, for the foreseeable future, remain exactly what they are right now. Shapes in the dark that we can describe with real confidence and still never see with our own eyes. There's a strange kind of awe in that if you let it settle. We have learned to read a planet we can barely touch, to find its hidden oceans of ice, to trace a scar the size of a hemisphere, to feel the shrapnel of its birth buried thousands of kilometers down, all from a handful of radar passes and the quakes recorded by a single lander that is now dead and gone. Mars has been keeping these things secret for billions of years, and it's only in the last handful of years, only from the data of a machine that already died, that we've started to make it talk. And the most humbling part is knowing how much is still down there, unread, in an archive that outlived the robot that wrote it. If you rode this all the way down to the mantle, you're exactly the kind of person this channel is built for. So subscribe and switch on notifications, because Insight's data is still giving up secrets, and the moment the next buried structure surfaces from it, we'll be here to break it down first. And I want to hear from you. Which one got you? The sheets of hidden ice at the equator holding a sea's worth of water? The possibility that nearly half of Mars is a single buried crater, or the shattered fragments of dead worlds, still frozen in the planet's mantle after 4.5 billion years? Tell me in the comments. And if you know someone who still pictures Mars as just an empty red rock, send them this. Because the truth is that quiet desert is one of the best kept archives in the solar system, and we have only just learned how to open it.